Welcome to the Envision RISE podcast show, a podcast that helps foster respect through inclusion, service, and equity.
Before we start, let me have you talk about IpX a little bit, and so that folks that maybe usually listen to the Envision RISE podcast can get an idea of why this is a crossover for us and who you are.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, I'm the VP of Services for IpX, which is the Institute for Process Excellence, and we're process people. So what we do, in a nutshell, which is so much more than what I'm probably about to say, but it's really helping people with their processes with regards to thinking about your digital thread, digital twin, and that's everything from concept all the way through to product decommission. And that could be any aspect of that, right? That could be the engineering side, that could be the manufacturing side, that could be change in configuration management, it could be bills of materials, EBOM, MBOM, service bombs, all of that good stuff. So in a nutshell, that's my side of the business. What's fun is often, we do break into some, we call it OCM, organizational change management. That really is the people side of large scale transformations and tool implementations that we work on. And sometimes that's the hardest part. And people often just forget about that side and they're focused at the tool project and the tool implementation. And I think that that's a mistake because people make or break it. I think we all recognize that, probably from mistakes that we've all been through at times, and making sure you spend just as much time on the people side really can help ensure a successful implementation of a new process or a tool as well. So to me, that's the really cool tie-in of what we have with your side of the business is the people side and making sure that we consider how people feel, how they're going to react, how are they going to handle these kind of situations, right? And just making sure that that's intentional.
And, so for those that don't know, Envision RISE is a sister company of IpX. And Envision RISE was sort of born out of IpX, looking at organizational change management and how do your people interact with change. And for most humans, we don't like it. We just, even when it's good change, even when it's exciting change, it stresses us out. And if you can figure out how to effectively support and manage your people through changes in process and tools and product, everything is so much easier, right? No matter how great your processes are, no matter how cutting edge your tools are, if your people are not feeling supported, if they don't feel like what they do for your organization matters, if they don't feel seen within your organization, that can take the legs right out from under any new process or tool or product that you're putting out there in the world, right?
Absolutely. It's really important.
So that's where we come in. And a lot of times people want to feel more comfortable putting diversity, equity, and inclusion out kind of over here in the world of, well, that's a really squishy, touchy, feely thing, and it doesn't really apply to us. But it does. And especially when you're looking at the inclusion piece of things. And, so Brandy, on your side of the house, the CM2 part, when I think about how we include people in processes, I think about how the user and owner of a particular process interact when you're talking about policy and process and all those kinds of things on the IpX side. Is that true?
That's very true. Very, very true.
So what happens when an owner of a process decides to make a change, doesn't talk to the person who actually uses it all the time, and it's not done well, or it creates more problems than it solves? I often hear you say it's a solution looking for a problem right now.
Sometimes that's the case. And you're absolutely right. I think everyone's probably experienced that, whether they were the person that made the mistake and made a change without including people, or they've been a part of a process where a change has happened and you're like, what the heck is going on?
Mhm.
Why did something change? I think people struggle with change. There's no surprise there. Everyone understands that. I think the hard part is just not knowing the why
Mhm.
and not have been a part of that change, especially when someone has been at a company for a number of years. You don't feel valued. You feel that your opinion isn't needed and that changes are being made without you. And if you're including people throughout the process of making any kind of a change, then they're going to feel like they had a voice. They're going to be more willing to support that, more willing to be able to share their support with others, their peers or subordinates, as well as make sure that that change is adopted well.
So that's where DE&I comes in for a lot of organizations. And when you've got, obviously we've heard a lot over the past couple of years about how important it is to have a diverse workforce. That's where innovation comes from. That's how new ideas are brought forth. And that's how we see things like there's a Forbes report. And for those that are regular listeners to the Envision RISE podcast, you've heard me say this a few times. The studies show that organizations that are more diverse and inclusive, so not just diversity, but are more inclusive within their culture, do almost 20% better on the revenue line than their counterparts in the same industry, same, comparable organizations. So there's a business case for it too. But I think what I want to hear from you, Brandy, let's talk about the focus that organizations give to their product, and then we'll talk about getting that focus to the people.
Yeah. Okay. Talk about product. Now we're talking about something I can relate to, and I think it's helpful. I think just talking about it from a product perspective, I think will help many relate. I think there's just a lot of lessons learned and experiences shared here, and I think when I just come back to the importance of valuing people. And, I guess on the IPX side, we always focus on people, processes, tools, and data, just like you said. But like, I think it'd be really interesting just to dive into the people side of that. We spend so much time on the processes, tools, and data. And, people really are the foundation. And organizations, we've seen it time and time again. They can somehow be successful without really great processes, without amazing tools, and sometimes without even great data. But I think everyone can agree that without good people, there's really no company that can really be successful. So, companies with a lot of turnover really struggle, and there's a lot of really good reasons for that. So, I want to touch base on the RISE human resource model first, because I think this is what really allows us to assess an organization's DNA. And to me, what I think it does is it reflects the intentionality of an organization with the employee. And we have a similar model on the IPX side for product. And the product side of our DNA model really is, think about it like new product development. It starts from concept all the way through to decommission. And the RISE DNA model is very similar. And it's more of from an employee aspect of when they're onboarded and throughout their career. And then also, decommission is probably a harsh word, but when they have the opportunity to retire. So it's really, the employee's progression throughout their relationship with a company. And hopefully that's a long duration. I think back when I was a kid, it was my dad spent 30 years at a company, but that's harder these days. It doesn't seem to be the case. And I think that there's some repercussions for that. So, I guess I with regards to that, can you tell me a little bit here about how Envision RISE, might, from your perspective, helps a company to support an individual through their career?
Absolutely. And, it's something you and I were talking about not while recording, we were talking a couple of weeks ago about how a lot of times organizations put tons of money, energy, effort, focus on product, but they're not putting the same efforts into the people. And you can really see it, especially now with things like the Great Resignation. Then we have progressed from, well, people aren't resigning anymore, but they're certainly not going above and beyond. So we're getting into quiet quitting, where people will do exactly what their job description says and no more, no less. And we are, unfortunately, what that is showing organizations is how much they have relied on people to give more than they are perceiving to receive. So when you look at the HRM model, I mean, we really have to look at even before the person is hired and walks in the door the first day. How do you go about writing a job description? What does your job description actually look like? And how much lifting is that last little bullet point of miscellaneous duties as assigned? How much heavy lifting is that actually doing? And why aren't you putting those tasks into your job description? So, because you're not really being transparent with a potential new employee if 40% of the tasks of that role actually fall under that last bullet point of miscellaneous duties as assigned. And that even from right there, the honesty, the transparency, it's got to be there. Otherwise, people are saying yes to accepting a job that they don't have a clear picture of. And that can start unwinding really fast. And when I think about DNA, I've talked to folks about this before. If you think about DNA within a living organism, the goal is for those strands of DNA to meet up exactly, for there to not be weakness, for there to not be a break, for there to not be something unraveling within those DNA structures. Otherwise, what that shows up like in biology, that can show up as a developmental issue. It can shorten the lifespan of the organism. It can, in humans, it can cause all sorts of disabilities, whether that's mental, physical, emotional disabilities, can be traced back to the DNA. The same thing happens in organizations. If you've got one side of the DNA that's strong and the other side is fractured and weak, you're going to end up with a fractured and weak organization. So it's really important that when you look at the HRM model, you can see how both strands line up exactly so that they are the strongest they can possibly be. That comes from not only being honest and transparent at the beginning, but having those important connections the whole way through. So whether decommissioning in this case is retirement, or it could even be going into a new role within the organization. It could be just resigning from the organization to go someplace else. It could be a layoff. There are a lot of ways that employees become decommissioned within an organization. And I know that's kind of a cold way of putting it, but I think that matches well. And when you're changing and developing product in an organization, hopefully there's lots of discussion going on. Hopefully there's lots of give and take, that it's not just top down saying this is what we're going to do, and that there's no opportunity for input, insights, feedback, for somebody to say, well, wait a minute, there's a problem with that new part. It's really hard to get. It's going to end up slowing things down. What else can we do? The same thing happens with the humans. So it may be that we're doing this new process at work and it's going to affect this department. And here's what we need from you, department or individual. And you've got to be able to have those conversations of, well, wait a minute, this change you're talking about is going to require an additional 30 hours a week from my department. We don't have that to give. We need another half FTE to hire. So your change in process or policy for the humans can actually kind of break your humans a little bit.
Yeah, yep, it sure can. And I love the way you talked about that. And I'm thinking about, the way we handle change management, change and configuration management of our product is so intentional, right? Like there's so many companies that we're working with who want to make a very efficient and effective process to be handling that so they don't miss a beat. Right? They don't miss anything. It's all about proper impact analysis and understanding all of the considerations that need to happen. Why don't we treat our people in the same way? And it's really is very similar. And I'm not trying to dehuman our people by saying that there's a process for this, but to me, that when I look at the HRM model that we have, it's just very evident to me that people within an organization need to be treated with intentionality. And I think that's what we're talking about. And it's about the intentionality, the same way we treat our product with intentionality. And without that, people don't feel valued. They recognize that they're not being treated intentionally. And that turnover can be really high. And I think that I know I've lived and I understand some of the repercussions, but from your research and experience, what is the cost of high turnover for companies?
It's high. And it can be up to 18 months of the position salaried. So, I mean, if you have someone who's at a high level within your organization and is making $100,000 a year, you're talking about $150,000 to replace someone. Now, those are dollar amounts that we can put onto particular roles and things like that. But you can plan on, at a minimum, 6 months of the salary for the position, regardless of what it is. So there's a cost there. But there's also this human cost. And really, as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, so I hear a couple of things out there in the world. One is that we'd really love to have a diverse workforce, but we just aren't getting diverse candidates. Okay, there are absolutely reasons for that. And not all of them are, well, your company's terrible at diversity. It can be geographically, you're not going to get that draw. There can be a lot of reasons for it. But when you do have a diverse workforce, the last thing you want to do is feel like, okay, well, we checked that box, we're done. We're diverse, our DE&I is good. Because if you're only hiring for diversity and you're not doing that intentional work of making sure that everyone in your organization feels included, and not just friendly, not everybody feels like it's friendly here, but that microaggressions are not something that's really present within your organization, that your policies and procedures are written in such a way that they don't inadvertently or intentionally elevate a particular population within your organization, that you've got equitable practices that are accessible for people, that you don't make your policies so difficult to understand that if someone needs help with something or needs an accommodation, that they don't feel like, it's just not worth it. So they don't. All of those things are about being intentional. Organizations are getting better at onboarding. We're getting better at making people feel welcome. Hey, we're glad you're here. If you're working in an office, here's your desk. Let's take you out to lunch. Let's onboard you that way. But how many times have people felt really, really welcome and excited to start their new role at a new organization? And within 3 weeks, those same people are feeling stranded, are feeling overwhelmed, are questioning why they decided to go with this organization to begin with. And that all has to do with the way each side of that DNA model is handling their requirements. There are requirements of employees, there are requirements of employers. And those two things have to meet each other consistently. Or you end up with an employee who not only feels excluded, but isn't going to speak up. That if you don't value me enough to be intentional with my presence here, why would I speak up? And that is definitely something that's a change in the workforce. That is a change in culture that we see much less of that. For those of you that are older Gen X or baby boomers, you might be hearing me say this and thinking, well, that's just lazy. That's terrible. That's not the way it was in my day. Maybe, but I'm here to tell you that things have changed. And younger Gen X, the millennials, and now the older Gen Zs, they are changing the way that the workforce functions, and they're changing the expectations.
Yes, they are. And you mentioned the first 3 weeks of a job, and those are such critical moments. And people judge so quickly, and they set their mind up, and that first impression is really hard to change. It's no different than a first impression when you meet someone. It takes some time, and it takes a lot to change that. And it's still, I'm really surprised that sometimes I still hear everyone's replaceable. All people are replaceable no matter what. And I'm like, gosh, it's just like, why, when people, I think organizations understand that people are very important and how much it costs them to replace someone, to train someone, all of those considerations that take. And if someone is there for decades, it's such a huge loss. Why do you think that we just don't see the equal efforts of continual improvement of the workforce and the processes that create that intentional behavior?
So I think there's a little bit of tunnel vision that we get so obsessed with our product or our service, or that those are things we can actually see and measure. If we've got cars are a good example. If you've got two brands of luxury cars, they can easily figure out how well they're competing with one another. And what are the advantages of this particular brand of car as opposed to this one? And a lot of times you may be looking at a very small amount of difference for cost that really it's boiling down to which shade of blue do you prefer and which manufacturer makes that particular shade of blue. But those are easy things for organizations to measure. And when you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, when you're talking about people, it's a little harder to measure. We look at things like retention rates. Some organizations have started looking at who's getting promoted, starting to look at what does our leadership team actually look like? What are the demographics of our senior leaders, our board, or those first level supervisors? Where do we start to lose the diversity? And I think it starts to feel overwhelming, and you start to get into an area where a lot of people are just really uncomfortable with this human aspect of what we're actually measuring. And we're not talking about, let's check a few boxes. Hey, how many people do we have of this particular ethnicity? And how old is our workforce? And, how many women do we have in leadership roles? Yeah, you need to know that, but that's not really the thing I want you to focus on. Yes, you need to have that. But all of that is going to mean nothing if you're not truly focused on developing equitable practices and creating and maintaining an inclusive workforce. The first thing to go from a budget when organizations are trying to make their quarter or make their year is training. Why would you say goodbye to training first? You would never decide that some piece of your product needs to be the first thing to go. Why are you deciding that some piece that helps provide growth to your employees should be the first thing to go?
Yeah. Yep. It seems more like a nice to have, and when you're making those kind of decisions. I think when I go back and think about, the life cycle, like we're talking about, the onboarding through career development, all of that, and offboarding at some point. It's just so synonymous with the product lifecycle that we deal with, and with CM2, and the CM2 principles. They really do apply here really well with regards to like baselines, throughout a human's life cycle, as an employee in an organization. And, all of these snapshots in time that we show on the human resource model, those are baselines. And all of the linked data sets, such as credentials and training records and certifications, 360 performance reviews, all of those things, they all become, an artifact. They're all a digital twin of your employee. And so, to not improve and standardize and conduct continual improvement on the digital thread of your employee is just such a missed opportunity. Don't you think? I'm hoping that we open up some eyes today.
Absolutely. When I think about some of the instructors on the IPX side, what do they say? Linkages, linkages, linkages. And really, our first interaction with a potential employee is their digital twin on their resume.
Yeah, it really is. It is.
And we continue to build towards that. So, for all the manufacturing and engineering folks that may be listening to this podcast on the IPX side of the house, you can apply all of those things to your people. You really can.
You already have the knowledge. That's what, to me, it's just easy to transfer. It's the same thing. So there's just so many things that are correlated. So you already have optimized that process on the product side. So you can transfer that knowledge over to people very easily.
Yes.
So that's the hard part, is I think that just very different people that always those areas feel very segregated. And if we're able to really think about, CM2 from the enterprise perspective, it does apply. So. And again, I think, when it goes to ROI, right? I think everyone starts to think about that from a leadership perspective. You can't discount that. And, I think a company should think about and understand the risks associated with ROI on their retention process. And, if you were really to do a true impact analysis of all of the repercussions and what does it cost you, I think that they would be very surprised. It's very similar to like an opportunity cost, right? So, if a person, and I'll even think about just as a simple consideration, right? Is what if a person becomes handicapped? And, what is the data that should be captured and travel along with that person now so that all the proper provisions can be planned and verified? So it's really no different. And, I'm just thinking about other, DE&I considerations that could be treated the same way, right, as a change to a product. Could you give us some other examples there?
Absolutely. So think about an employee who you hire an employee who's deaf. Maybe it's likely your first employee that you have hired who is deaf. What does that actually mean for your organization? Does it mean that you put all of the requirements and all of the pressure on the deaf employee? Or do you start looking at the way your organization will need to change in order to create an equitable experience for that person? Does that mean different technology is needed? What does it mean for the people who work on the team with that individual? How do you get people to change their behaviors and essentially change the culture a little bit in order to include and welcome this new person who's going to bring a completely new perspective to your organization and likely to your product or service, and is going to create great value for their new perspective that you didn't have before? But we do have a responsibility to make sure that we have equitable practices in place and that that new employee has exactly what they need in order to thrive, and that we're not constantly requiring them to do a lot of heavy lifting for something that we should be assisting with.
Yeah, it's so similar to an enterprise change assessment, but for people. Just that impact analysis. If an organization can be good at managing development, change, and configurations of their product, they can become, and they already have the skills to do that with their people. Safety and environmental, like to me, that is a requirement now that has infiltrated all of the processes in a manufacturing organization. So that's often a very detailed consideration when any kind of change to a product. And I think what we're talking about today really is an extension of safety and environmental for people in some light. And it's valuing and capturing and meeting those requirements of an employee throughout their career. And I think this is what it really means to be intentionally meeting people's needs where they are throughout their career for retention. That's intentional retention, don't you think?
Absolutely. Intentional retention is such a great way of putting it. And, as I think a little more about this, I'm thinking about when a product is released to market, and we have some very recent examples of this, which I won't call out any companies here, where they knowingly released a product that could potentially harm someone and kind of went along with, well, it's going to be so expensive to fix it before we send it to market because we've already promised Wall Street, or we've already, made commitments to getting this product out there. So we're better off just to cross our fingers and hope. Some of those products have killed people, have injured people to the point where they are now disabled and their lives are completely different. And, losing hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits. The same thing happens with your people. If you decide that it's just too expensive or it's just too difficult to create an equitable culture that gives people what they need when they need it in order to help them thrive as employees, not only is your organization going to experience expensive turnover, there's legal repercussions to those things as well. And it isn't just a matter of, well, we'll cross that bridge if we come to it. With more and more organizations competing for fewer and fewer potential employees, it takes 2 seconds to do a Google search to figure out, do I want to go work for this organization? Oh, they've had 3 lawsuits in the past 6 months that they've settled. Anybody can see anything now. Go to Glassdoor. Doesn't even have to actually be a lawsuit. It can just be a lot of opinions of employees that, if you're not going to be intentional about this work with your humans, it will come back to you, and not in a good way.
That's right. Absolutely. I've been a part of interviews where people have brought up Glassdoor comments and asked me my opinion. So it always comes back. And sometimes we rationalize those decisions due to cost, or time, schedule implications, etc. I guess it's always just good to, it's not that people have bad morals, but sometimes it's just hard to do the right thing with that kind of pressure.
Yep.
So I guess just expanding on a couple of these items, I'd love to just back up for a second and talk about history and organizational change management and diversity, equity, inclusion. These concepts and methodologies are obviously not new. Affirmative action is DE&I. It's not quotas.
Right.
But these terms, they've been blacklisted because they've been done so incorrectly. And I talk to a number of people in my daily life that just have a bad taste in their mouth for these type of concepts because it's been shoved down their throat in a bad way, or someone who may not be right for the job has been the chosen one and been promoted. So when done really well, though, on the other side of the coin, it is simply synonymous with good organizational change management. So I just want to get your thoughts on that. When you think about it from an organizational change management piece, that's where we can take away some of that bad taste in our mouth. And what are some good high-level practices there that give you the same benefits?
Absolutely. So this is really, and it's really back to being intentionally caring about the people who make your organization run. And that includes looking at them as individuals and caring for them as individuals. And I know that compassion and empathy and caring, that those words make some people really uncomfortable. I'm not asking you to give your employees a hug. I really am not. Please don't go hug your employees. I think I speak for all HR departments when I say don't start hugging your employees. But that attention, that intentionality makes such a huge difference for people. My goal for every organization is that when you're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, that it doesn't feel isolating, that there's no group walking into a discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace that feels like I'm going to be blamed for things, that just because of my race, my gender, my age, my religion, whatever, that I'm going to be blamed for things I didn't even do. And you can see it on people when they're in meetings about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can tell the people who will just shut down and say, "Oh, you're going to blame me for this. It's not even my fault." This isn't about blame. This isn't about including everyone except. This is inclusion means everyone. That means meeting people where they are, getting them what they need. The goal here is that you don't have to think in terms of DE&I because you're doing it so well. And it's just organizational change management, right? This is some detail under the umbrella of organizational change management and what your employees need in order to feel as though they are included, to make them feel a part of the organization, to help them overcome any obstacles that they may be experiencing that is keeping them from thriving in the workplace. That's all this is.
That's all this is. So, I guess to kind of pull it together, I think people seem, I find, to in the technical realm that it's you just can't put standards around the things that are more soft and squishy, but it's just simply not true. Your business processes should always be a collection of your best practices and lessons learned, and that's what EnvisionRISE can bring to you. And it really is your industry standard best practices at employee retention, and employees are your most valuable resource. So, what I'd like to see for us is I'd like everyone to expect in 2023 to see maybe some more organizational change management topics come from us that can help provide that foundation for DE&I within your organization. And it doesn't have to be a targeted specific DE&I approach, but it's what's going to naturally come out of really good organizational change management. And OCM is a concept that can infiltrate and expand to the entire enterprise. It doesn't have to be segregated. It's something that does apply to the enterprise. It's not just an HR department type thing. It's not just a product development kind of thing. And, I think in time, intentionality is the catalyst for an improved culture. And it accommodates everyone, like you said, right where they are throughout time. And because people, what meets them, when they first start is not necessarily what's going to keep them there later. So this has to be continual, and it needs to be throughout time. And hopefully this can help companies retain and that experience and that knowledge base that they've invested in their people.
Absolutely. I think, a couple of things I would suggest people do if you're really serious about organizational change management. I want you to look at the processes that you use to make a change to your product or to your service, or, how does a change happen on that side? And then look at what happens on the people side when you're going to make a change, whether that's you're introducing a new role, you've hired a new person, or a person's being promoted, or even for that individual who has had a life-changing event. What happens, even if it's temporary. So a few years ago, I broke my ankle, and it was terrible and awful, and I hated every minute of it. But there were suddenly new obstacles for me. A job the job that I was in required about 80% travel. What did that actually mean for me during the recovery period? Did it mean that I had to, this was before COVID times, so people weren't particularly comfortable with Zoom and Teams and all those kinds of tools that we're comfortable with now. That wasn't really something that my employer at the time was willing to do. Their thought was in person is the only way this job gets done. So what were the changes that needed to be made? And some worked, some didn't, but there was no process in place. And it was I was kind of left to my own devices to go figure it out. I'm resourceful. I figured it out. Fine. Not every employee is going to do that. Not every employee is going to feel comfortable with that expectation. So if we can think ahead and start getting intentional about, well, we don't have any trans employees here yet, but chances are at some point we will. Get a policy in place now. If you're worried about, which bathroom does a trans person use? What locker room does a trans person use? How do we make sure that our systems aren't dead naming someone who maybe transitions as an employee? How do we do all those things? Start thinking of it now, because if you've got it in place and then you hire someone or an employee transitions, processes are already there and the harm's not caused. You're ready to go. And what that shows your workforce, whether they're impacted by that or not, is that you're thinking ahead and that you are putting the needs of your people as a priority.
Yeah. As soon as you accept and you plan and you take care of your people, that will grow the loyalty back.
Absolutely. And when you've got loyal employees and you're not constantly trying to backfill a role that is empty, and hurrying to just get it filled, that makes your products and services that much stronger.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Stacy. This has been an excellent conversation. I look forward to having more with you about these kind of topics next year.
Me too, Brandy. Thank you so much. And 2023, I think, is going to bring some more of these crossover podcasts.